Welcome, stranger. He accepted an irresistible job, but little did he know, he was embarking on a flight that would change his life forever. Mike, a private pilot, was hired to transport a businessman to a paradise island. On board, strange objects, eerily quiet children, and behavior he would never forget. What he found on the island haunts him to this day, and the truth he hides could destroy lives. Did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends, and comment below. What would you do in Mike's place? It all started out very simply. But sometimes the most disturbing things in life come disguised as perfect opportunities. My name is Michael Anderson, a pilot for almost 2 decades, and I've seen many destinations and transported all types of passengers. When I got that call, it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. Private work, short flight, well paid, but the pay was exceptionally generous. And the contractor, it was Diddy, a name everyone knows. That caught my attention immediately. At first, I was hesitant. You know, when an offer seems too good to be true, it usually is. But there were bills to pay, and the possibility of a family vacation made it seem reasonable. So I accepted. I was ready to do what I do: fly, drop off the passenger, and go home. Home. On the day of the flight, something struck me as odd from the start. The hangar was unusually busy, more people than necessary. Security guards pacing back and forth with serious faces. It seemed like everyone was in a hurry, almost as if they didn't want to be seen. There was a heavy silence in the air, the kind of tension you only feel when something is about to happen and you don't know what it is. As soon as I got on the plane, I started noticing the details. The boxes being loaded with no clear identification, just codes and labels that no one bothered to explain. When the passengers arrived, that's when I felt my first real chill. There were children. They were well dressed, but there was something in their eyes that bothered me. They seemed disconnected, as if they were physically present, but their minds were somewhere else, somewhere other than here. It was a flight to an island in the Bahamas, one of those isolated islands you see on postcards but rarely visit. It was supposed to be just a job. I was the pilot, that's all. And my job was to get to my destination. But as I sat in the cockpit and prepared for takeoff, the feeling of unease only grew. There was something about the situation that wasn't right. But at the same time, I was too committed to walk away. As the propellers began to turn and the sound of the engines filled the cabin, I did what I had always done in my career. I focused on the job. I disconnected from what was beyond my control and focused on doing what I knew how to do. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was crossing an invisible line, that I was walking into something I would never forget. As the plane gained altitude, the cold sensation down my spine only got worse. And that's when I realized that this flight wasn't just going to be another job. I was about to witness something that would change my life forever. And if I had known what I was getting myself into, I never would have agreed. The cabin lights blinked calmly, but deep down, I knew something was off. And I was about to find out how far this could go. We were in the air. The tranquility of the sky contrasted with the atmosphere of the plane. I wanted to believe that everything was normal. But as the hours passed, I realized that this was unlike any flight I had ever been on. In the cabin, the air pressure felt heavy, and every little noise seemed amplified. I tried to focus on the monitors, the control panel, anything that would distract me from the growing uneasiness that was consuming me. From the cockpit, I could see part of the cabin through the partially open door. The children sat silently in rows near the back of the plane, always quiet, always with those blank expressions. It was a disturbing contrast to the rest of the group. The difference in energy was striking. While the adults laughed loudly, shouted, and cheered in an almost chaotic way, these children seemed imprisoned, emotionally absent. It didn't take long for me to realize that there was something strange about the cargo as well. When I first boarded the plane, I noticed a few boxes and bags of varying sizes being loaded. I didn't think much of it at the time, but something about the smell coming from some of them made me think of substances that, at the very least, should have raised suspicions. There was a chemical, perhaps medicinal smell that mixed with other aromas that I couldn't identify. This increased my sense that something was deeply wrong. That's when I started to hear it. First laughter, which turned into muffled screams. I knew there was booze, but it sounded like much more than that. It seemed like acts of complete insanity, which the cockpit could not completely hide. The voices grew louder, and I could clearly hear loose conversations, mentions of substances, names of people, references that seemed alarming to me. But what caught my attention the most were the children. Always quiet, always still, as if they were there only as extras in a grotesque show. My co-pilot, Peter, seemed as uncomfortable as I was. Every time we exchanged glances, it was as if we were sharing the same doubt. Is this really it? What are we doing here? At one point he turned to me and said, "Mike, something doesn't smell right. We need to be careful." I knew he was right. But our responsibility, our commitment, was to get the plane to its destination. Nothing more than that. There was a moment when I heard a more intense argument coming from the rear cabin. One of the passengers seemed to be out of control, shouting something unintelligible. All I could hear was the sound of objects breaking and a muffled murmur, like a plea. I wanted to look. I wanted to understand. But I felt helpless. We were thousands of feet up, trapped in that metal capsule with no way to intervene. And so the flight continued, the minutes stretching out like hours. The atmosphere grew denser, almost suffocating, while anxiety grew inside me. As we approached the island, I couldn't help but feel as if we were entering something much larger, something we didn't understand. My only hope was to land, unload all the passengers, and leave this dark mystery behind. With something told me that upon landing, things would start to get really strange. When I saw the island in the distance, I felt a shiver run through me. It looked like a slice of paradise, but deep inside me, something screamed that this place had a dark secret waiting for us. And I was right. The plane touched down on the island with a slight bump. The sound of tires against the road echoed for a second, like a distant warning. I glanced at the co-pilot, Peter, and we both exchanged a look of momentary relief. We were on solid ground, but what awaited us was far from rest. When the plane door opened, a tropical aroma invaded the cabin, a sweet smell of salt and vegetation, contrasting with the tense environment in which we had spent the last few hours. We got off the plane to help disembark, and for a brief moment, I thought that maybe it was all just a mistaken impression. The beach looked like something out of a postcard, white sand and crystal clear water, reflecting the blue sky. But it wasn't long before that idyllic facade began to crumble. We were greeted by a group of men, all wearing sunglasses and clothes that were too elegant for the tropical climate. They didn't greet us, just waved us out of the way, while they began organizing the evacuation of the passengers. Diddy, always surrounded by his companions, got off the plane, smiling as if everything was perfectly normal. The kids got off last in silence, their gazes lost and their clothes out of place. That's when I realized that this wasn't just a fun trip. Before we could get back on the plane, one of the men approached us and with a stern expression, informed us that the Diddy wanted us to stay for the party. It would be disrespectful of us to refuse, he said in a tone that left no room for questioning. Something about the way he said those words sounded like an order, not an invitation. I looked at Peter, who just nodded without saying anything. They took us to an area of the island, near a large mansion that stood imposingly in the distance. The music was already playing loudly, mixing with the sound of the waves crashing on the beach. The mansion had an air of grandeur, and at the same time something dark, as if it held secrets that should not be revealed there. They gave us clothes to wear, something that seemed more like a bad joke than clothes. Extravagant clothes, which clearly made us look like part of a humiliating act. At the entrance to the mansion, they offered us drinks, and I noticed that Peter hesitated before accepting. I followed suit, but one of the men stared at us, as if to say that we had no choice. I took a sip and felt a strange, bitter taste, something that was not just alcohol. I tried to ignore the nausea that followed, but it was already clear that we had no control over the situation. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was the opposite of what one would expect from a paradise. The lights were low. The music, although loud, had a distorted, almost unsettling tone. People were laughing and talking, but it was as if there was something mechanical in their gestures. Diddy moved among his guests, greeting them like a perfect host, but there was a coldness in his eyes. The children were led into a separate room, and I couldn't help but notice the fear in his eyes. As I walked away, the music continued, the lights pulsed, and suddenly the room began to spin. My legs felt weak, and I knew in that moment that there was something in the drink. The world around me became increasingly blurry, and my vision blurred. I felt a hand on my shoulder, maybe from Peter, maybe from one of the security guards. And then everything went black. My body gave out, and the last thing I heard was a distant laugh, a sound that seemed to echo down a long, empty hallway. When I opened my eyes again, the light blinded me, and my body ached in places I didn't remember aching. I knew something had happened during that party, something I couldn't quite remember, but the truth was about to be revealed to me, and not in a way I was prepared to face. When I finally woke up, my body felt like it weighed a ton, and my vision took a moment to focus. The lights were still flickering, but more slowly and irregularly, as if the party was winding down. My head ached, and an uncomfortable feeling of numbness washed over me. I didn't know how long it had been since I'd turned it off, but it was clear that something had changed. The party guests were still scattered around me, but the atmosphere had become eerie, almost ghostly. Peter and I were left in a dark corner of the main room, on cushions that looked like they'd been thrown there to keep us from the cold floor. I looked at him and saw that he was waking up too, but there was something different in his eyes. He looked scared, lost, like someone waking from a nightmare and unable to shake off the fear. Before I could ask him anything, one of the security guards approached, indicating that we should get up. We were taken to the top floor of the mansion. The hallway was long, lit by small red lights that gave the room the feel of a dark room. Footsteps echoed, and the sound seemed to creep through the room, increasing the feeling of isolation. It was as if we were being taken into the heart of something monstrous, a place that should not exist outside of nightmares. We entered a large hall, decorated opulently, but somewhat darkly. Heavy curtains blocked out any natural light, and statues at either end seemed to watch us. In the center of the room sat Diddy, and a few of his closest guests, their smiles not quite real. The room exuded a sense of power that was intimidating, as if everyone there was subject to an invisible force. Diddy greeted us with disconcerting warmth. He offered us more drinks, which we automatically declined, even though our stomachs were churning. He didn't insist. He just laughed in a way that made me even more tense. Then he gestured, and a door at the end of the room opened. Inside, I could see some of the children who had boarded the plane with us. They were sitting, their clothes now wrinkled, and their eyes vacant. It wasn't a room for games, or for rest. It was a place where something terrible had happened, and that was evident in the look on one of the children's faces when he met mine. Diddy then began to speak, but his words seemed to echo in the back of my mind, without me being able to really process them. He spoke about commitment, about being part of something bigger, about sacrifices. His words were spoken in a friendly way, as if he were offering us a privilege, but each syllable carried a weight that made me want to run away. I felt my palms sweat, and, without me realizing it, Peter moved backwards, almost bumping into a table. It was at that moment, Mom, that one of the guards approached and pushed Peter back to the center of the room. His expression was hard and devoid of any trace of emotion. Diddy continued to smile as if nothing had happened. You see, don't you? We're all in this together. There is no choice, only acceptance. Those words echoed in me, sending a shiver down my spine. Something in the way he spoke made it clear that there was no way out of this situation without serious consequences. The children were taken back, and we were left alone with Diddy and his security guards. The silence in the room was suffocating. Diddy approached us and, in an almost fatherly tone, said, "You are special. You are the ones who fit in. This, my friends, is a circle that few are privileged to know." His every word seemed to wrap my mind in a web of confusion, where nothing made sense. But everything seemed dangerously inevitable. Before I could react or understand what it meant, one of the security guards approached me, holding a small video camera. He played the recording, and there I was, in a vulnerable state, doing things I had no memory of. I was filled with intense dread. Now I knew, it wasn't just about getting off this island. I was trapped in something much bigger, a secret they would make sure I never revealed. I woke up with my body heavy, as if I were trapped by something I couldn't see. The cold floor and the soft light that filtered through the curtains left a trail of discomfort. My eyes were cloudy, and the memories of what had happened the night before came in disconnected flashes. Faces, macabre laughter, flashing lights, the image of children. It all seemed like a nightmare, but the pain in my body was real. Peter was next to me, still unconscious, with marks on his neck and dry lips. I looked around and realized that we were in a different room than the one I remembered. It wasn't the same one where we were received. This one was narrower, the walls covered in dark, worn wallpaper, with a musty smell permeating the air. There was no one else there. Just me, Peter, and what seemed to be the weight of our own fear, suffocating us. I tried to get up, and every movement seemed to send a warning to my brain, as if my body was protesting against any effort. The headache throbbed with every step, but I managed to get closer to Peter and shake him gently. He woke up slowly, and our eyes met for a moment. I didn't need to say anything to know that we were both terrified. A sudden sound caught my attention. The door was thrown open, and one of the security guards who had been at the party walked in. His expression was impassive, his gaze blank. He gestured for us to get up and follow him. We had no choice, so we did. We walked down the narrow hallway, which seemed longer than I remembered. Each step was a reminder of our vulnerability, and the walls felt tighter and tighter, suffocating. When we reached the main hall, the scene had changed. There were no more guests, no more music. Everything was dark and silent. Diddy was there, sitting in a leather chair, watching us. As we approached, the security guard pushed us forward, and Diddy, with a smile that seemed sharp, beckoned us closer. He didn't say a word at first. He just stared at us as if he were waiting for something. Finally, he broke the silence. "I imagine you're confused, aren't you?" His voice was soft, but it carried an ominous weight. He gestured, and one of the guards brought out a small device, a video camera. Diddy pressed a button, and the recording began to play. The footage showed me and Peter in a completely out-of-control state, doing things I couldn't remember. It was clear that we were under the influence of something, and everything was being used as a weapon against us. The camera turned off, and Diddy looked directly at us, his eyes as cold as ice. "You know what that means, don't you?" He didn't need to explain. The message was clear. Those images were our sentence. Every word he said seemed to bury the feeling of helplessness even deeper. He talked about secrets, about how we were now part of something bigger, something we couldn't let go of. He talked about consequences, about the destruction of our reputations, of our families. Every word was a veiled threat, but at the same time direct. There was nowhere to run, no way to hide. We were trapped. I felt Peter's heavy breathing beside me. His eyes were filled with fear, and I knew mine were too. Diddy gave us one last warning before he dismissed us. "You will do whatever it takes to keep what you saw here a secret, or you will lose everything you have." His voice was calm, almost soft, but the weight of that threat seemed to crush everything around us. We walked out of there carrying more than fear. There was a feeling that our lives had been ripped away from us. Every step toward the plane seemed to take us further away from the person we were before we landed on that island. I knew we would never be the same again, and that secret, that recording, would be a ghost that would haunt us forever. The return to the plane was enveloped in a heavy, almost unbearable silence. Diddy's words still echoed in my mind, mixed with the buzz of fear that seemed to grow with every step. Peter and I didn't exchange looks, much less words. There was nothing to be said. I had a knot in my stomach, and the bitter taste of helplessness in my mouth. I felt like we had left a part of ourselves on that island, a part that we would never get back. When we entered the cabin, I noticed a suitcase on one of the seats. It was open, and inside were wads of cash, payment for the job, but to me, it seemed more like a reminder of the price we were paying, and what we would have to carry from that moment on. I wondered if that money could ease the weight of what we had seen, of what we had done. Deep down, I knew it wouldn't. I prepared the plane for takeoff with mechanical movements. My hands moved instinctively, adjusting controls, pressing buttons. But my mind was elsewhere, trying to process everything that had happened. When the plane finally left the ground, I felt a brief and illusory relief, as if being in the air, away from that island, could erase everything that had happened there. But the reality was different. Those events were engraved on my soul, and no matter where I flew, they would come with me. During the flight back, Peter remained silent, his gaze lost on the horizon. I don't know if he was reliving the same memories as me, or trying in vain to erase them. The sky was dark, and the clouds moved slowly below us, like a shadow that followed us. The journey seemed endless, but at the same time, I knew that what awaited us at the final destination was even harder to face. When we finally landed, there was no celebration, no sigh of relief. Just the silent impact of the landing gear against the asphalt. A reminder that we were back in the real world, but bringing with us an invisible burden. In the hangar, a few men waited to pick up the plane and the suitcase. They didn't say a word. They just gave us a look that made it clear that everything had been planned, that every step had been anticipated. I arrived home that night with a fake smile on my face. My wife hugged me, and I tried to respond, but inside I was in pieces. The feeling of unease was almost palpable, as if I had become another person. As she told me about her day, I just nodded, trying to focus. But the weight of what I had witnessed on that island pulled me from the reality around me. I looked at my children playing in the living room, and felt a tightness in my chest. How could I protect them from such a dark world, where power could destroy lives and manipulate truth? The image of the children on the plane came back to me. Their blank expressions, their looks that seemed to beg for help. I felt guilt crush me, an overwhelming sense of helplessness, because I knew I had done nothing to save them. The paycheck we had received, the suitcase full of money, now seemed like a cruel joke. Every bill was stained by what we had witnessed. And every time I thought about using it, it was like selling my very soul. But the fear of being persecuted, of having my family threatened, made me realize that I had no choice. The feeling of being trapped was suffocating. That night, while everyone else slept, I sat at the kitchen table, staring into the darkness outside the window. It felt like there was something out there, watching, waiting. It wasn't just paranoia. I knew they were watching me. They had made that very clear. From that moment on, I would be a prisoner of my own memories, and the secret that was now part of me. Staring into the dark horizon, I realized that the peace I so longed for would never be achieved. There was a price to be paid for knowing too much, and I was already paying it. All that was left was to try to protect my family from the weight of this dark truth, and to try to somehow live one day at a time, even with the constant feeling that something or someone was always lurking. And so, with a heavy heart and eyes fixed on the darkness, I knew that my journey was far from over. If you engaged with this story as much as I did when I told it, don't forget to leave a like to support the channel. This helps us bring more impactful stories like this one. Subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any news. We still have many mysteries and secrets to reveal, and if this story intrigued you, share it with your friends. Who knows, you might not be able to discuss together what really lies behind these shadows. Thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next video.